Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Leibowitz, and everybody who pays attention to culture, politics, or at least most people who pay attention to culture and politics have heard of the 1619 Project. I recently read at least Nicole Hannah-Jones's portion of the 1619 Project in preparation for this, and I also read this great book by today's guest, 1619 Project, A Critique. And today's guest is well equipped to do it. He's an economic historian whose work focuses on the United States and the broader Atlantic world. And he also explores the intersection of history and political economy. Phil Magness, welcome back.
Happy to be here.
Man, you are just one writing ass dude. Like every time I turn around, there's something you're writing on Twitter. And for AEI or no AIER, I get the two confused because I use them both as sources. Yeah, right. But this was great, this 1619 Project. So for those who don't know, what was the 1619 Project? What is it? And what is the purpose of it?
Right. So the 1619 Project was originally a special issue that came out of the New York Times Magazine in 2019. And it since has evolved into books. It's evolved into a Hulu documentary series and a whole stream of political editorials. But the original version was a feature investigation by the newspaper into the history and legacy of slavery in the United States. At least that's what it was pitched as. When you start to read it, though, you figure out it has a very clear political agenda. And that agenda is basically to use the history of slavery and U.S. history in general as a political weapon in the present day to argue for a very left-wing, progressive, redistributive economic agenda. And that includes everything from slavery reparations, but also just policy prescriptions on the hard left. They sound a lot like the Green New Deal. And essentially what they are doing is they're taking instances of events in the past. So 1619 was the year the first slave ship arrived off the coast of Virginia. So that's why they commemorate that as the date. And it's it's an important event, something that we should study. But they're basically taking the use of that as a past event and trying to weaponize it in the present day to argue for progressive economics.
Now that's a leap. Right? Because even if, and I by no means do, but even if you do accept their entire narrative about the history of the country, that doesn't then translate automatically into their economic and political policy proposals, right? That takes a leap to do so. But they nevertheless use this as the justification, and it's as if they don't want you to understand that they're making a leap. For instance, if you just take something like the minimum wage, right?
Right.
To say, well, these are all the bad things that happen, so we're going to implement the minimum wage as partly a fix. But then you have to prove that the minimum wage is actually going to rectify the things you're saying it's going to rectify,
right.
But it doesn't. But there seems to be, because they're persistent. I mean, in prison, I dealt with this all the time. Slaves built the country. Slaves built the country. And it's just persistent. And just to make it into the present day, this is a tactic, right? That is, when people constantly put forth narratives like this, it's a tactic to implement an agenda. Like socialism, for instance, has been utterly wrecked by economists, historians, philosophers, but they keep coming back with new versions, new variations, and arguing for it. If you look at our current politics, you've done more work than anybody in showing the harm that tariffs do, but yet people with an agenda keep pushing it. Or you look at just something common like the George Floyd death. Over and over and over again, they push the narrative that it was an overdose. So what I mean is that people do this, books like this, the 1619 Project, it's like overwhelming you to keep pushing a narrative at you until you just basically, it's a war of attrition where you just get sick of it. So right. So I commend you for actually taking the time to write the book and battle it. But all this, I guess, is my long way of saying why. Why did you decide to take on the task of debunking this?
Yeah, so I am an economic historian that focuses on the economics of slavery. Most of my early scholarly academic work was on slavery as an economic problem. Wrote an entire book and several dozen articles on slavery in the Civil War era. So this was my subject area. And when I started reading the 1619 Project, I encountered exactly what you described, this perpetuation of a myth about capitalism supposedly being wedded at the hip to American slavery, and this claim that slavery is what industrialized America, made us rich, put us in a position of economic prominence today, and therefore redistribution is owed to the victims of slavery. So this was the narrative that was being put forth. You see it in Nicole Hannah-Jones's argument. She claims that the American Revolution is really just kind of like this proxy war fought to defend slavery, and then she follows from there. She argues 19th century American economic development comes out of the plantation system. Now, I study these questions in depth and do so empirically, and this argument is just utter nonsense. Cotton production accounted for maybe 5 to 6% of GDP before the Civil War. Is not by any means the major driver of the American economy. And if anything, the Civil War itself shows the backwardness of the South vis-a-vis the industrial North, in everything from military might to productive ability to simply being able to feed their population during the course of the war. So to take an event like that and then claim that slavery is like the true but suppressed and secret engine of American prosperity, which is essentially what Nicole Hannah-Jones does, I looked at that and I was like, this is just absolutely absurd. And yet she's advancing it by repetition and advancing it by cherry picking some really bad scholarship that has an ideological agenda.
And I'm definitely going to get to those folks. Now, the claim that I was most familiar with prior to reading her book and then your book was the claim that the American Revolution, far be it from a fight for liberty, was actually a fight to keep slavery. The argument was that the colonists wanted to secede because the British were going to end slavery over here. One of the things, and I'm going to let you debunk it, but one of the things that popped out at me right away is they talked about how the crown offered to free the slaves of the colonists who were rambunctious, who were, opposing the crown. But that intimates that there was opposition to the crown prior to the offer of freeing the slaves. You can't then use the threat of freeing the slaves as the reason for the rambunctiousness. Right. So this tactic that they employed reminds me, and I'm getting a little ahead of my skis here, but of Lincoln with the Emancipation Proclamation, right? It's use is to try to gin up some rebellion on the part of the slaves in the colonies at the time to basically undermine the revolutionaries or those who would rebel. But what else? You really did a really nice job of this. So I'm going to let you explain the rest of it on what is wrong with her idea that was what the revolution was about.
Absolutely. So Nicole Hannah-Jones is seizing on this kernel of truth. And this kernel of truth is that in late 1775, the governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, he's the last royalist governor of Virginia, put out an announcement and said that any slave of a rebellious plantation that makes their way to my lines and joins my militia will be freed. And that there are some records that this actually does happen. Now, notice he says rebellious plantation. He exempted loyalist plantations, including his own. This is a guy that's a slave owner, has a very large plantation off the coast or right outside of Williamsburg, Virginia. But he does this proclamation, and it's in late 1775. So we're talking November 1775. Now, remember, Lexington and Concord was April 1775. So the war is already underway. This is the major problem in Nicole Hannah-Jones's thesis is her timeline doesn't work. The battle starts in April 1775 with Lexington and Concord, when the British troops move on those towns to seize the arsenals and they meet resistance. A Continental Army is organized in June of 1775. George Washington's appointed commander. So the rebellion is already underway. Just as you say, this cannot be the instigator of the rebellion if the rebellion started 6 to 8 months earlier. But what's really going on here, this is like a last-ditch desperation move by Lord Dunmore. he has already been chased out of the colony of Virginia. So he's the governor at the time that Lexington and Concord break out. There are also near simultaneous events in Williamsburg. This is several days travel, so they don't have news yet even of Lexington and Concord, but he knows there's stirring of a revolt. And one of the things he does is almost on the exact same moment, he goes and seizes the gunpowder stores in Williamsburg and basically leave the capital defenseless. And his claim was that he was seizing the gunpowder. This is again April 1775 for the purpose of preventing. He claimed he had heard rumors of a slave revolt that was stirring, so he needed to get this gunpowder to a secure location. This is what he tells the civilian population. What he was really up to is he knew there were stirrings of a revolution, and he thought that they would be taking the gunpowder itself and using it to resist the crown. So he actually claims that he's trying to protect Virginia from a slave revolt at the beginning of the revolution. But it's really a pretext to seize the armaments in Williamsburg. So fast forward 6 or 7 months after this, Lord Dunmore has been chased out of the capital. He flees because even though he seized the gunpowder, it sparks such a backlash that Virginians start to descend on the capital and demand an answer from him. And he tries to go through all these motions of suspending basically the colonial legislature, trying to quell the rebellion that way. But he loses. He's moved on. He's chased offshore onto a warship. And then by November 1775, he's trying to regain his foothold in the colony. So that's when he issues this proclamation and says, any freed slave of a rebellious plantation that comes to my lines and joins my militia, you'll be given your freedom. But not to any of his own slaves, not any of the loyalist slaves. So it's really a move to try to stir up discontent and rabble and chaos, essentially, in the colony that he knows he's already lost in an effort to try to regain a foothold on the mainland. He's operating a government in exile on board this ship out in the river at the time, and this is his only last-ditch attempt to reconstitute British governance over the colony, and of course it fails. So his militia does assemble, and they're involved in a couple of minor skirmishes in late 1775, but he's basically chased off and out of there. So it's really not a sound basis to make a claim that the rebellion was fought over that, especially because the rebellion's already underway. Yeah. And Nicole Hannah-Jones has inadvertently made Lord Dunmore a slave owner himself, into this weird reinvented hero of abolition. It just doesn't make sense.
The William Lloyd Garrison of his time, maybe.
Exactly.
So what is the new history of capitalism? Yeah. What does it have to do with the 1619 project, and what does it get wrong? So it's three questions all in one.
Exactly, because they are intimately intertwined. So the new history of capitalism was an academic movement that started in the late 2000s, early 2010s on the very, very far left wing of the history profession, particularly anchored in Ivy League departments. It is Edward Baptist at Cornell, Sven Beckert at Harvard, and Seth Rockman at Brown are some of the big names of this. And these are groups of historians that purported in the early 2010s, they said, they named themselves the new historians of capitalism. They said that historians prior to us have not really understood or investigated capitalism, which is itself a load of nonsense. Economic history is one of the most established and heavily researched subjects in existence, but they purported themselves to be this new interpreter of capitalism as a historical mechanism. And in so doing, they focused on American slavery. And what they tried to do is reinvent slavery as a capitalistic institution. Now, the prior literature, before 2010 or so, when they burst into the scene, treats slavery generally, it's a throwback to a feudalist relic. And you think about this, plantations are organized almost like a feudal lord in a castle in the old world. It's one of the things that comes over, and slaves take the place of serfs in that system. They're provided for by the Lord. It's a really brutal system. It does engage in economic productivity, but it's generally seen as a economically inferior to free labor, as well as a moral abomination. just because it's slavery. But the new historians of capitalism, they come along and say, well, actually, slavery is not really this feudal throwback. It's really the essence of capitalism. So they play word games and they just redefine capitalism to say that it equates to slavery, and therefore capitalism is bad. Therefore, capitalism is tainted in the present day by this legacy of slavery. Now, where does it relate to the 1619 Project? So when Nicole Hannah-Jones puts this series together in the New York Times, she recruits a sociologist by the name of Matthew Desmond. And he's another one of these Ivy League Princeton professors. And Desmond, his prior academic work was on poverty in the modern day, but he comes at it from a very, very far left-wing perspective. And he writes his essay taking this ideological position that capitalism and slavery are wedded at the hip, and he builds his entire narrative about the economics of slavery by only cherry picking from the new historians of capitalism. Now, this is a problem because the new historians of capitalism, when they burst onto the scene in the early 2010s, yes, they make an academic splash, but they are excoriated by actual experts in this subject. Right down to finding issues of basic competence in works like Ed Baptist's claim. So Ed Baptist writes this book called The Half Has Never Been Told, again, stressing all his novelty. It comes out in the early 2010s, and it is ripped to pieces by academic reviewers who knew what they were talking about, including over this claim. He purports to calculate that slavery accounts for half of U.S. GDP before the Civil War, and it comes down to a math error that he made. It's actually like 5 or 6% versus half of U.S. GDP. And there's also misused sources, all this sort of thing, problems with this book. And yet Matthew Desmond cherry picks from it and repeats it as if it's like the gospel of American economic history. Now, there's another problem with the new history of capitalism. Because they put cotton at the center of the antebellum American economy, they have inadvertently rehabilitated an old argument that existed before the American Civil War. We refer to this as King Cotton theory. And what was King Cotton theory? Well, it was the slave owners' argument that cotton was such an essential product to the American economy that it was the cornerstone of U.S. prosperity. And therefore, if we struck a blow against slavery, if we ended the slave system, the entire U.S. economy would collapse. Turns out that didn't happen. We have a real-time proof that King Cotton was a false theory. And yet these new historians of capitalism have stumbled into rehabilitating it and asserting that it was the mechanism, it was the driver of 19th century wealth, when it turns out that this was just basically Confederate propaganda from 1860.
And they also, this Matthew Desmond, the people on whose data he relies, they actually came out and criticized him and said no.
Yeah. Absolutely. So there are a group of economic historians, Alan Olmsted and Paul Rohde, who study the cotton industry before the American Civil War. And one of the things they do is that they have evidence that cotton grew. It grew by about 400% between 1800 and 1860. We know this is an economic fact because the industry is expanding. And it's a large industry, but it's not the engine of the American economy. And what Olmsted and Rohde do is they ask the question, why did cotton grow so much before the Civil War? And the answer they come up with is seed technology. They bred together strains of seed and they made them more disease resistant, and they yielded more cotton per crop cycle. They figured out basically the technology of agriculture returns a greater yield. And this is just an objective empirical fact that's well attested and demonstrated. The new historians of capitalism, including Desmond, come in and they say, wait a minute, we're going to ignore Olmsted and Rohde's explanation for why this occurred and assert instead that cotton grew because slavery became more brutal and more efficient out of extracting coerced labor from the slaves. And this is just a theoretical argument. There's really no evidence that this occurred, that slavery becomes supposedly capitalistic in the sense that we beat the slaves harder at the time that we approached the Civil War and therefore got more cotton out of them. Slavery is a horrific institution. There's no doubt about this, but there's no mechanism that shows that beating people made it more economically productive. And this is the whole Ed Baptist argument, the Matthew Desmond argument. And Olmsted and Rhodey, they review this evidence, and they're the guys that have done the empirical work to show what's really happening. And their work has been misrepresented by the new historians of capitalism.
They also claim, right, that the double entry bookkeeping was invented during slavery.
Well, which is utter nonsense. So they place a lot of emphasis on accounting. And the argument is, it's just very facile. The gist is that slave plantations used accounting books. And at one point, Matthew Desmond says, well, we use accounting books today. In fact, we use Microsoft Excel today. Therefore, Microsoft Excel is derived from the plantation accounting books. And this is just utter nonsense. First off, I showed this in the book, that Matthew Desmond got this claim by misreading one of his sources. He read another book that said Microsoft Excel is not derived from the accounting books of the slave plantations, and he just misread the passage and misquoted it, essentially. But we also know double entry accounting, it dates back to like the banking families of 14th and 15th century Europe, in Italy in particular. Accounting is something that transcends all forms of modern economic activity. There are accounting books used by the Soviet Union to try to do its output targeting in its centrally planned Marxist economy. No one would claim that is capitalism because they use accounting books. It's just an absurd, facile argument that says slave plantations used accounting books, therefore they're capitalist. No, it just does not withstand factual scrutiny.
So largely, there's this claim that the prosperity of modern America is in large part a result of slavery.
Right.
Now, so I remember maybe 10 years ago, maybe a little bit less, a friend of mine read an article in the Wall Street Journal about how the worth of the slaves was 50% or so 80%, I don't remember, but a large number of GDP. And his argument was, look, that's how much the GDP they were. That tells you that it has to be part of our growth. And I said, dude, right, with the abolition of slavery, that wealth is gone.
Right.
Because you're counting the value of slaves. So that's gone. But you also have the utter destruction of Southern wealth during the Civil War.
Yep.
That was just broke. And the fact that the South largely lost the war for economic reasons.
Yeah.
But they want to tie Northern successes to Southern slavery as sort of a connector to go forward and basically to justify reparations.
Right.
Now, there's no way to quantify it, but how much of this country can actually, not in numbers wise, but it's, in significance, how much of the country's prosperity or the luxuries that we have today are a result of slavery?
Right. So the short answer is actually very little. And it's for the reasons you described. The American Civil War is immensely destructive, and most of that destruction occurs physically on the property of the southern states. That's where the battles are fought. That's where the biggest tolls are. That's where entire cities are burned down. Physical infrastructure is destroyed. It's left in a state of poverty for decades after the American Civil War. So that's the basic answer there. But you look at these empirical claims that are coming out of Desmond and the New History of Capitalism crowd. They're premised on a math error. They'll calculate the total value of slavery or slaves or slave outputs, and they'll put that in the numerator, but they don't adjust the denominator in a commensurate amount. This is just basic fundamental math errors that you teach in macroeconomics 101 is like, how do you account for GDP or output of a product? If you misalign your numerator and your denominator, you're going to get an inflated figure. And that's exactly what they did. To properly calculate this, they would not only have to run the calculations for slavery in the numerator, and they'd also have to make a similar adjustment for every single other sector of the economy and put that in the denominator. And if you did that, if you followed their methodology for, railroads, textile, food crops that are grown in the northern states and the free states, manufacturing, steel, iron, you name it. I mean, the hundreds of thousands of products that the U.S. economy is producing in that era, it turns out that slave-produced cotton and slave-produced tobacco, yes, they're staple crops and they are a large sector onto themselves. But again, it's like 5 or 6% of GDP, not 50% of GDP. So to make this claim that like this is the engine of American wealth, what's the same mistake the Confederacy made? The Confederacy deluded itself into thinking that its cotton was so important not only to its own economy but to the northern economy that if there's a war and we cut off cotton to the northeast, there will be a depression and economic ruin, and Britain and France will come to our aid because they also recognize the value of cotton. They have this elaborate theory they spun themselves into believing, and none of it happens.
Now, you do say that the 1619 Project gets some stuff right. Mm-hmm. So where are they right and their critics wrong?
Yeah, so I dug into this pretty heavily, especially in the early criticisms of the 1619 Project. So Nicole Hannah-Jones, she carries forward her argument across American history from the founding era to the present day. And one of the episodes she investigates is the American Civil War. And of course, we all know that's the Emancipation Proclamation. It produces the 13th Amendment that ends slavery. Slavery's abolition is a clear result of the war, and that's a good thing. But she looks into that, and she raises the question, this wasn't the intent of the war from the outset. Really, it was to quash a rebellion, to stop a breakup of the Union. That's the original impetus of the war, why the North calls out its truth, is to put down the rebellion in the South. Slavery becomes an issue over time during the war, and in part through conscious actions of Lincoln and in issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. But he turns out to be a much more complicated and nuanced figure there, because Lincoln is not just a supporter of emancipation when that exigency becomes possible. He also supported throughout the war an effort to colonize the freed slaves abroad. And there are all sorts of debated motives of why he would do this. The most charitable is he thought that a post-slavery society in the South, Black people would be repressed and targeted by eventually what becomes the Ku Klux Klan and all the horrors that we saw afterward.
And if that was his reasoning, he was right.
Oh, right. He anticipated brutal racial repression after slavery, and he argued, let's give it a safety valve. And that includes using government resources to relocate freed slaves abroad. The original most famous example is Liberia in Africa, is a country that's founded by freed American slaves. But Lincoln was also investigating, can we send slaves abroad into the Caribbean, into Central America, locations that we can establish U.S. colonies abroad. And he devotes quite a bit of attention and substantial resources in the American Civil War to this. We look at it as probably a harebrained scheme in history, but you can also see how this is shaping Lincoln's development. And he also views it as a mechanism to build support for anti-slavery. So it's part of his political coalition. This is just a well-documented fact. And what it comes down to is I actually wrote a book on this in 2011, Colonization After Emancipation. That's it's probably the longest or most thorough book length treatment of the colonization movement in the American Civil War. As I mentioned, my early academic work was very heavily on 19th century economics of slavery, and this was one of the products of it. And Nicole Hannah-Jones mentions this fact about Lincoln, and she gets piled on by certain historians that want to just do a celebratory version of the American Civil War, the emancipation story without this complication and without this nuance. So I actually came to her defense early on and said, even though the 1619 Project gets the American Revolution wrong and its economics are backwards and crazy and politicized, she is right to ask the questions about the complexity of the emancipation story. We as historians need to revisit that and go into depth and detail. And, originally, Nikole Hannah-Jones starts to defend herself without realizing that me, the critic of the economics of the 1619 Project, had authored this book. She tweeted out a link to it and tweeted out cited an article I had written in 2014 for the New York Times summarizing the thesis of the book and some of its major findings, and said, look, historical evidence is actually on my side on the Lincoln colonization issue. And then someone pointed out to her that I was the author of this, and she just lost her mind, went furious on Twitter, denounced me, went through and deleted all of her previous tweets that cited my work. And then in the later revised edition of the 1619 Project that comes out in the book, so she's deleted all of that section and replaced it with Ibram X. Kendi. So this is something that really speaks to, I think, Nikole Hannah-Jones's problems as an editor. She's not interested in discovery of truth. She's interested in propping up her team. And then anyone that criticizes her for any reason becomes persona non grata and vilified, even if she previously cited them. So I have the weird position of having defended a small segment of the 1619 Project and gotten canceled or removed from the 1619 Project for it, because I also, committed the sin of criticizing Nikole Hannah-Jones.
It sounds like religious belief to me. Whenever there's certain movements and ideologies that smack of religion, in that they have sort of this automatic pushback mechanism to any criticism. So if you, for instance, criticize religion, one of the things they will say is, well, the devil is blinding you.
Right.
So there's no way, how can I refute it? I can't overcome it. When you talk to conspiracy theorists, it's always, well, you're just buying the propaganda, or you're just believing what they want you to believe. You haven't looked deep enough. And here, one of the things they will say to you is, well, you're a racist, you're a bigot, you're white, you don't want to understand it. They don't actually address the claims.
Right.
Now, you have actually contacted her, the New York Times, to point out the errors that are in this thing. What has been the response?
It was complete dismissiveness. I approached this in a very professional way. I didn't go blasting out, here's all the errors of the 1619 Project after it appeared. I published scholarly criticism of it very early on, but I also contacted the newspaper and said, here are some empirical errors where you made math mistakes in Matthew Desmond's piece. Here is the example where you miscited a source about Microsoft Excel and plantation accounting books. You need to issue a correction. And it was done in a very professional way, contacting the editor, contacting Nikole Hannah-Jones, and thinking, hey, this is a chance for a dialogue. I disagree with your politics, but let's at least get the facts right and get everything on the same page, and maybe we can have a discussion about that. Instead, they responded by blowing me off. They responded by saying, well, this error you corrected, that's just a difference of interpretation. And the other thing, in the math error, they claimed to have acknowledged it and changed a footnote in a later version, but they kept the claim there. So it's like pretend corrections that don't really correct it, or just ignore this guy, dismiss him. And then in the meantime, after I had approached the newspaper behind the scenes by writing their editorial department and saying, hey, issue a correction, Nikole Hannah-Jones just goes into like a vicious attack mode on social media and starts denouncing me as unqualified to address the 1619 Project, starts attacking me personally. She does this with all of her critics. She had a really infamous tweet where she attacked other historians. She said, these are old white guys, basically. They don't get to say what the 1619 Project is, even though all the new historians of capitalism she cites are Ivy League white male historians. So there's a discrepancy here. She doesn't even adhere to her own attacks. She's posted pictures of herself making obscene gestures at her critics. I mean, just really unhinged stuff all over the internet. And the message here is, if you counter the 1619 Project, if you criticize it, no matter how scholarly or professional you are in your approach, she engages in this trollish personal attack denunciation, and then she claims that she's the victim. So just like all the tactics are there of a political activist, none of the journalistic integrity that one would expect for a project of this type.
So I'm going to tell you a little story that's reminiscent. There's a woman named Dr. Erin Corbett, and in the prison system, it was called the Second Chance Education Alliance.
Yeah, yeah.
What she was teaching was critical theory, basically
Right.
critical education. When my friend that was in the program let me read her article called Critical Pedagogy, I said, this is garbage and it should not be taught to criminals, because basically what you're doing is you're giving criminals an excuse for their behavior. Yeah. You're telling them it's not them, it's everything else. So that was in prison.
Right. It's Marxist at its core. So
yeah. So, flash forward, they had a hearing here in Connecticut because they were going above and beyond with prison commutations,
right.
Letting guys out of prison. And I actually had a debate with criminal justice professor Michael Lawler, who was he was in office under Governor, who's the previous governor? It wasn't Lamont. Dan Malloy. They reshaped the prison, prison policies, the correctional policies. And he conceded to me that the commutation has nothing to do with reforming criminals. It's to let people out. And he didn't think it was a bad thing. He thought it's basically to rectify past injustices. So they had a hearing here in Connecticut, and my friend and I went and testified. Look, there's no way that, given the way the prisons are run, that the people that are here can assess their behavior to know if it warrants letting them out.
Yeah.
So we got blistered on social media by ex-convicts, and then this woman, Erin Corbett, stepped in of the critical theory, and she basically chimes in. Basically, we're sellouts of some sort. So I told her
the revolutionary cause.
Right. So I said to her, "Look, you think that of me?" I said, "I'll tell you what. Take this issue. I'll send you a link and you and I can publicly debate the issue." To which she responded, "This is not my area of expertise. So I can't do that." And she basically then wanted to have all her friends help her out. And I said, "It's funny, you didn't take that perspective of not being an expert when you attacked my friend and me on social media. Now that I'm calling you out, now you're not an expert." So then a couple weeks ago, this same friend posted something defending, it was a black guy saying Charlie Kirk was not a racist, right? And so she responds with, "He's a coon," all the basic, the sellout to this, that.
Yeah, the Uncle Tom.
All that stuff that comes from these people. And it's similar things. So I told her, I said, "Okay, I will debate you on critical theory, critical pedagogy, critical race theory, whatever you want. Let's have a debate." She responds with, "You don't have the library to debate me," and just disappears. And my point is that with the critical race theorists and the 1619 project, listen, if I'm wrong, show me, right? Show me the data, show me the evidence. But all you're doing is making claims, and then when you're challenged, getting defensive.
Yeah.
That's not scholarship. Right. That's not intellectualism. That's emotionalism and propaganda masquerading as education.
And it's an attempt to control the debate and keep it in their own ideological echo chamber. Nicole Hannah-Jones and the new historians of capitalism are both guilty of this. They only want the discussion to be among themselves, and they want to be cited as authoritative in their proclamations that capitalism and slavery are wedded and that all wealth is ill-gotten today. They don't want to engage with their challengers. They don't want economists scrutinizing their math. They don't want other historians outside of the 1619 Project pointing out its factual errors. And the response whenever this happens is to lash out and attack the person, not engage the substance of the debate. And this has been the trajectory of the 1619 Project since it started. So this is why we basically published this new revised edition of my book, because I had written some critiques of it very early on. But the 1619 Project myth walks through the entire debate from 2019 to today, showing this trajectory of how the 1619 Project defended itself. And the theme that you start to see over and over and over again is that they do this like sidestep. They pretend to be scholarly when they need to be scholarly, but when they're challenged, they switch into editorial opinion writing. And they take cover under the fact that they're journalists. They say, well, you can't hold us to the same standards as scholars. We're just opinion writers. And then the opinion is just a stream of venom from Nicole Hannah-Jones smearing and attacking her critics. And this, unfortunately, has filtered over into the way the 1619 Project is used in the present day, as if it's like this curricular basis, is like this work of scholarship, when it's not that at all. It's opinion journalism that's playing fast and loose with the facts.
Listen, folks, get this book. It's a great book by Phil Magness. I highly recommend it. Phil, where can people find you?
Yeah, so the Independent Institute, and that's independent.org, is where I post most of my short commentaries and current work. You can also go to the website. We do have a bookstore, so 1619 Project Myth is up there, although you can also find it on Barnes & Noble and Amazon and all of those things. And then I'd also say, follow me on social media. It's Phil W. Magness on Twitter, or X as it's now called. Happy to see comments and feedback on that. And again, independent.org, Phil W. Magness.
Always great takes on X, by the way. I love it. You throw in a little humor, which I enjoy.
Exactly. Got to have fun with it.
Phil, thanks a lot for taking time to be with us here today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
All right. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Leibowitz. Till next time.